Hey guys, it's Eric, owner of Farpoint Farms here in the mountains, North Carolina. Tonight, something a little different. I want to talk about radio and communications in general in the event of an emergency. And for part one of this, I'm going to get just a little bit into it, but I want to talk to you about my specific experiences with catastrophes and not being able to use the conventional way of communicating in both of those two catastrophes. And the first one here that I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk to you about how radio made my life a whole lot easier and people in my neighborhood, is this. I'm going to tell you the story of Hurricane Fran, which happened back in the mid to late 90s. I think it was 96, it may have been 97, pretty sure it was 96. Hurricane Fran came through the area I was living in just outside of Raleigh. And it was not expected. In fact, I'll be honest with you, I was young. I was thinking of other things. I had a lot going on in my life, like most of us do often. And so I wasn't really paying attention to the news, okay? So I had no planning for Hurricane Fran. I hadn't bought extra food. I hadn't bought extra water. I hadn't bought extra anything. I hadn't filled up the gas tank on my car. Nothing. It was just me having an average day, which, if you think about it, is exactly how most natural catastrophes or real global catastrophes happen. We don't really have a whole lot of time to prepare. We wake up one morning and the world has changed. And that's pretty much how Fran played out for me. I had a normal day. I went about my normal way. And that night, my mother called about, I don't know, I think it was 7:30. And she said, hey, what are you doing? You should leave. Because I was living in a 1972, I think it was, single wide trailer, a little 10 by 50. And in a neighborhood, it was a nice place to live. It had beautiful, big, tall trees. I'd never experienced a hurricane before in my adult life, and so I had no point of reference. But she called and said, maybe you ought to leave and come to where I'm at, And I thought, I hadn't heard anything about it. I thought, like mothers often do, that she was maybe overplaying the situation a little bit. So I blew her off the way that kids normally do. And so I said, forget about it. I looked at my girlfriend, said, what do you want to do? She said, I haven't heard anything about it either. Let's just do our thing. So we started watching TV, and I don't remember what was on, but I remember the power going out about 8:15, and I remember thinking, that's a bummer. And I figured, we'll end up going to bed early or whatnot. We lit a few candles, and much like a lot of these things are, it's fun at first, right? It's kind of a, we're gonna camp out, but we're camping out inside the house. Night rolls on, and by about 9:15, maybe 9:30, it was evident that this was a serious storm. We were listening to a little AM pocket radio. In fact, this one's missing the cover, but it's not too dissimilar from this, except this one has shortwave bands. But the one we had was just an AM, FM, had a little clock built in, and it was something that was a hand-me-down from my dad. Ran on 2 AA batteries. Those batteries were probably as old as the radio when I had it in my possession, but we turned it on. We were listening to the 50,000 watt station in that area. That's 680 WPTF. It's a great station back then. I hope it is still now. So we're listening to it, and they're talking about how this is pretty serious, how the storm has somehow changed direction. Now it's going to roll right over the top of us, and then somehow it's gotten stronger and meaner and angrier. We decide, hey, you know what? Maybe it's a good idea to leave. So we hop in the old car, and we back out of the driveway, and we make it about 15 feet before we run into our first downed tree. Not a big tree, maybe 6 inches in diameter at that point, but I don't own a chainsaw at this point in my life, so that is it. We're stuck where we are. So we pull back in the driveway, and both of us agree we're just going to have to make the best of it. So not going to sleep, obviously, at this point. We decide we're going to wait it out. I'm sure it'll blow past. It doesn't. It blows right over us, and it was, I'm not going to lie, it was one of the more frightening things I had dealt with up till that point in life. It was very strong storm in a very old mobile home with some very big trees that were dropping limbs, and it was so loud that you couldn't really hear yourself communicating with each other. It was that crazy, and you could tell a lot was going on outside. The wind was so strong that it actually would blow out the candles in the house occasionally because it was just coming right through this old home that we were living in. You could see the back wall of the mobile home moving in and out, so we were just kind of waiting for the end. In fact, we actually did what you're supposed to do during a tornado. We went in, we didn't have, there's no middle of a mobile home, and there's certainly the doors are not going to protect you they would in a conventional home. So we hung out underneath the desk, and that was it. We hung out underneath the desk and put our sleeping bags there and had a candle and just kind of hung on and listened to the radio until the radio went out for a while, because obviously even 680 had some issues as the night went on, but they were able to come back on after about an hour or so on diesel generators, no doubt. Night passes. I'm trying not to make this story too long or too painful, but night passes. morning comes and we awake, and it's time to go outside and see what the world looks like. And if you're familiar with Fran, it was pretty bad. We walked outside and most of the trees had lost most of their leaves and a lot of their limbs, and we were very, very lucky. Again, I'm in a 10 by 50 mobile home from the 70s, and surrounded by trees that were, you know, too big to hug. They were so big. And somehow or another, other than a few holes in the roof where branches had come down and kind of poked it, we survived. And my car survived. It was covered in branches and whatnot. I'm sure it took a few dents, but it was still intact. It was still drivable. And that's a pretty cool thing, because most of my neighbors were not so lucky. The two houses directly behind me were both destroyed. One lost the entire back wall when a tree came across it and shaved it off. The one off to the right there lost the kitchen. A tree came down through the kitchen, broke off that whole front of the house. So both those houses were total loss. Across the street there was a relatively new double wide, and it too was destroyed as a tree had come down right in between the two sections of the double wide and actually split it, dumped it and the occupants into the area where it, you know, used to have the crawl space. They both were okay. The people behind me were both okay. As far as I know, everyone in the community was okay, and that's a good thing, because there was no way to get out of there. There was trees down every 5 or 6 feet, or branches big enough that you couldn't drive around them or over them, all the way up out of our division. And even if you had left our area and got to a bigger road, I won't say a main road because it was pretty rural, you still couldn't have gone anywhere. There were trees down everywhere, and every power line was down, and everything was down. No power, obviously. No phone, which was a bit surprising, and no water. Our community was on a community cell water system, so it had one giant tank that fed all the individual houses. No power and no backup generator on that, so that was it. No power, no water, and no way to get water out, because, you know, unlike having a well where you could pull that water up and out, it was pretty dire. Of course, being young and in just surviving a pretty interesting night, we all had fun. In fact, I think most of the neighborhood had fun, even the ones whose houses were damaged. A lot of them were renters, so they didn't care as much. And so we just enjoyed it. We emptied out our fridges little by little over the next 48 hours, cooking our stuff out on the old, I had a hibachi, like a $10 El Cheapo hibachi grill. And then we just picked up sticks in the yard and cooked, and it was a great time, right? But by day 3, the food all went bad, right? All the fresh stuff, everything that was in the fridge, it's gone now. It's rotten. In fact, it was really getting rank. So all that had to go out. And liquids, right? The toilets were already starting to become kind of not so pleasant, because we weren't going to waste water to refill our toilets. So I was obviously able to use the yard for number one, but, you know, things got kind of ugly in there as well really quickly. Same thing was happening with our neighbors, right? Maybe they had a case of beer, or maybe they had some soda, or maybe they had some bottled water, but very few actually had enough to last more than that first 48 or 72 hours. And now here's where things get interesting, and I am getting to the part about radios, I promise. After those first 48 hours or 72 hours, the attitude in the neighborhood kind of changed. We were still all helping each other as much as we could, but more often than not, people were a little more unfriendly, and they were just motivated to get out of that subdivision. So we found people with chainsaws, and we slowly cut paths for the cars to get out to the main drag. And what we found when we got out to the secondary roads was the same situation. A lot of trees, a lot of damage, a very narrow path, if any, to kind of navigate. And so we got in the car, like everyone did, I'm sure, and tried to find something that was open so we could get some water, so we could get some ice, so we could get some food. And we found nothing. Everything was shut down. A lot of the stores were damaged. Where I lived was a good 20 minutes from the nearest grocery store, and we couldn't get to that grocery store. It was still blocked in many places. But there were 2 gas stations. Unfortunately, both of those were closed. They were damaged. They had no power, so they couldn't pump gas. So we came back to the house. And this is where radio starts to come into play. All the people in our neighborhood are all kind of branching out, trying to find places that still have stuff. But still no phone after 4 days, and still no power after 4 days, and still no real news after 4 days. So some worrying starts to set in. I had a TRC 444, and here's a picture of it right here. That's a Radio Shack AM 40 channel radio that I had installed in my car, and it actually wasn't but a few months old, I believe, at that point. In fact, it may have been brand new. and I had a 102 steel whip. Now, granted, this is the 90s, so there were more people on the radio, but I don't want to give the impression that the radio was always just, people rambling nonstop. In fact, we had a local channel, Channel 35, that everyone talked on, but beyond that, it was sporadic at best to find a local conversation that you could be a part of. It was on day 4 that I decided to go fire up the car again and turn on the radio and see if I could get any information that way. Now, by this point, local radio was on, and they were pretty much repeating the same thing we were seeing, and that was that things were kind of bad. Most stores were closed, most groceries were closed, the National Guard was in the area, and they were setting up points, but most of these points were in much more populated parts of the city, and I totally get that. However, on CB radio, I was able to call out, and of course, because of that 5 to 7 mile range that a mobile setup is going to have, I was able to reach another guy within the 5 to 7 miles, actually quite a few of them. And we found an emergency network that had been formed. This was an impromptu thing. This wasn't React. This wasn't something like you'd find on the ham bands. This was just guys and gals who were in need of stuff or who knew where stuff was, who were relaying that information to other people in the area. And thank goodness for that, because we were able to find that there was a gas station that still had water. It was on city water. It was like the last gas station out on the city line. So they were just saying, bring your bottles and fill up at our little outside spigot 24 hours a day. Even though the store itself was closed because no power, we were able to go and get water that day. I was lucky. I still had about a half a tank of gas when all this happened. Again, I hadn't planned or really prepared for this, so I didn't know that it was coming, or I would have filled up my gas tank like most smart people would have, but I didn't because I just didn't pay attention. No way to get gas, but luckily I was able to go back and forth 4 or 5 times, fill up water. We were able to flush the toilets. We were able to help out other people in the neighborhood that wanted to just throw all their bottles and stuff in there. And as the days went on, they did the same for us. We gave them jugs and water bottles, and they'd go and get them filled up and bring them back. As the days went on and those places farther out, closer to town, started to get their power restored, we were able to get things like ice and some foods. Not really fresh food, not meats really, but we were able to get ice. We were able to get cold drinks because, again, this was in August or early September, 90 plus degrees every day and high humidity in the Raleigh area that time of year. So it was something else. But CB radio really saved the day. We were able to communicate. I wouldn't have known about that water, and I wouldn't have been able to spread that to other people in the neighborhood if it weren't for CB radio. I wouldn't have known when the first gas station down the road finally got its power back and got us ice. To make a long story even longer, 14 days before our power was restored at the house, and for some people that was just the beginning of the nightmare because they had lost their homes and were forced to relocate or at least camp out until new homes or repairs could be done. But CB radio stuck with me at that point as a way that I could always make sure that no matter what else went wrong, as long as I had a radio that was working, I would be able to access the information I needed locally. And that is the end of part 1. In part 2, I'm going to talk about the many different types of communication that you see here and why they're all important, why you should maybe consider investing in it. And I call it an investment. I'm calling it insurance and an investment. Some people use the word prepping or survivalist or whatnot. I never considered myself to be that. But I do believe in investing in the future, and I do believe in preparing in the sense that it's an insurance policy against things that go wrong. Having survived that and another incident where, again, this was a few years later and cell phones were down, it happens. So I hope you'll stick around. I'm actually going to film this right now, but it's just want to break this up because I just feel like it's going to be too long of a subject to cover in one video. Stick around for part 2, and I'll see you next time. Take care.